going to take a few extra minutes today to make 4 comments about the situation in Egypt. First, anyone who takes Judaism seriously supports oppressed people who yearn to be free. Anyone who takes America seriously supports persecuted people who dream of liberty. Anyone who takes Western values seriously supports crushed people who rise up for justice. And so in all 3 of these components of our identity, we cannot help but root for those who sincerely desire democracy, liberty, and freedom in Egypt. We Jews have a long history and a long memory of Egypt. Egypt will always draw us to her. We will never really be free of Egypt. The central narrative of Jewish life is the Exodus from Egypt. It established for all time and for all people that oppression is abhorrent to God. Human beings are born to be free. The parting of the sea parted the chapters of history. Before the Exodus, pharaohs were normative. After the Exodus, freedom prevailed. Before the Exodus, darkness covered the earth. After the Exodus, humanity stepped into the bright sunshine of a new day. There would still be slaves. There would still be tyrants. There would still be suffering. But from that day forth, it would be the pharaohs who were on the wrong side of history. And justice was on the side of those who tried to break the shackles of oppression. Remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live, the Bible emphasizes. Do not oppress the stranger, for you yourselves have been strangers in the land of Egypt. Proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. The blessings of freedom are natural and self-evident, granted to us by our Creator, who has endowed us with certain unalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. These principles are ingrained in us. We cannot hold them true and self-evident for Americans alone. They are either universally true and self-evident, or a colossal sham whose purpose or consequence is to forever separate the free from the unfree and to create 2 categories of people: those who are deserving of freedom and those who are not. And so I state without any hesitation, I support all of those in Tahrir Square who are fighting and dying today for freedom, liberty, democracy, justice, and civil rights. 2, not all those in Tahrir Square who are opposing the Mubarak regime are fighting for freedom, liberty, democracy, justice, and civil rights. Democracy is a system of government with competing institutions, checks and balances, pluralistic expression, majority rule, and minority rights. Democracy is messy and complicated and requires commitment and discipline to persevere even through the daily frustrations of having to tolerate the other. As Churchill explained, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. Democracy takes time to develop. It takes patience. It takes a mindset of pluralism, accommodating other people's opinions. Democracy is not a one-time event. Democracy is not a one-time revolutionary moment. Democracy is not one person, one vote, one time. It's surprising how often Americans and the people of the West confuse elections with democracy. The Iranian regime was elected. Hezbollah was elected. Hamas was elected. Hitler was elected. All of these elections, by the way, were fair in that they did, in fact, constitute the will of the majority of the people on that election day. Democracy requires secular institutions of democracy, secular courts, political parties, freedom of thought, expression and assembly, a free media, regular elections, fighting against corruption, a civil society and civil institutions. 3, therefore, the real question is Egypt headed toward more democracy, more openness, more tolerance, more pluralism, or is Egypt headed in the opposite direction? Is Egypt headed towards greater freedom or greater oppression? What will the new Egypt look like? Will it look more like Iran or more like Poland? Will it look like Gaza, that is controlled by Hamas, which itself is an outgrowth of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood? Or will it look like Hungary? Or will it even look like Russia, which under the circumstances wouldn't be too bad? Both forces, the forces of progress and the forces of regression, are fighting on the streets of Cairo. And I have no illusions about the nature of the forces of regression. Some experts in the last week are suggesting that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is moderate and nonviolent. I'm not an expert. However, I align myself with those experts who contend that the Muslim Brotherhood has hardly become a soft, cuddly brotherhood of Democrats. They are anti-American, anti-Western, anti-democratic, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and believe in the implementation of Islamic law interpreted strictly and fundamentally. Al-Qaeda's second in command, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was one of the leaders of the Egyptian Brotherhood. Hamas gleaned its inspiration from them as well. If Egypt is headed towards more democracy, it will be good for all of the forces of enlightenment. It will be good for Egyptians, good for Americans, good for Israel, good for the stability of the world. Democracies tend to ally with each other. Democracies tend not to go to war with one another. If Egypt is headed in the opposite direction, we are entering a very dangerous epoch. The stakes are enormous and should give everyone pause for sober thought. Egypt is not Tunisia. It is not Jordan. It is not Lebanon. It is not Syria. It is not even Iran. Egypt is the Arab world's beating heart. Egyptian culture dominates the Middle East. Egypt has a 1 million-man army brimming with the most advanced weapons that American dollars can buy. Egypt anchors the Arab-Israeli peace process. The Camp David Accord, signed 32 years ago, eliminated the possibility of an existential war on Israel because all of the other neighbors realize that they cannot win a war without Egypt. All of the wars that Israel has fought since have been really asymmetrical skirmishes between a modern army and insurgent forces. Those of us who remember the massive tank wars in Sinai shudder at the possibility of a newly hostile Egypt. Egypt sits on the Mediterranean Sea. It controls the Suez Canal. Up to 10% of the world's sea cargo goes through the Suez Canal. Egypt has been a reliable ally of the United States. We have intelligence gathering networks there. We have military arrangements there. Egypt even sent soldiers to join the American-led liberation forces of Kuwait in the first Gulf War. The ramifications of Egypt turning against the West are cataclysmic. What are the chances of Egypt making democratic progress? I don't think anyone really knows. This is what is terrifying so many people today, including the so-called experts and those who have responsibilities of leadership. I would point out the obvious. There is no evidence in the Middle East to suggest that the overthrow of the previous order has led to a better order. In fact, the preponderance of the evidence suggests otherwise. The Middle East is not Middle Europe. If we look at successful democratic revolutions in our time, the revolutions of Europe in 1989, each of these countries had democratic histories to draw upon. Even in Iraq, this semblance of democracy, if you can even call it that, if whatever Iraq is, if it holds after we withdraw, it will have been purchased through massive American treasure, massive American arms, and American blood. In the history of human affairs, revolutions do not always succeed. And even if they do not always make things better. And even revolutions that ultimately make things better usher in a period of intense struggle for the future. They talked about the rights of man in 1789 France, too. But soon the guillotines were unsheathed and the streets dripped with blood. They talked about democracy when they overthrew the Tsar in 1917. And there was, in fact, democracy in Russia for 8 months until the Bolsheviks choked off the oxygen of freedom for most of the remainder of the 20th century. They used the language of human rights in 1979 Iran, until some years later when Ayatollah Khomeini finally seized permanent control. Yugoslavia descended into chaos, inhumanity, and depravity until the Americans and the American-led forces pulled them out of that. Revolutions release revolutionary energies that are supremely difficult to control. All revolutions have a period of time. No one really knows how long, but it is limited and brief. It is a window of opportunity to determine the future of the country. During this time, there is usually a bitter struggle that is often violent and savage. It's like a great inhale, the intake of oxygen before the massive thrust. This is where we are now, or soon will be. And here is where America and its allies have a crucial role to play. If America can help chart a path from here to a better there, we will have a chance to create a better, more peaceful, safer world. If we fail, God help us all. The departure of Mubarak is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. It is at best the end of the beginning. It is only now that the hard work of building up civil society begins. 4, Israel. Just a few brief thoughts. Israel has more at stake in the outcome of this struggle than anyone else, save perhaps the Egyptians themselves. In the long run, a more open, democratic, tolerant, and American-allied Egypt is in Israel's interests. An Egypt that is ruled or unduly influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, an Egypt that turns away from the West, an Egypt that tears up the peace accord with Israel is an unmitigated disaster. 2 brief points. First, the upheavals sweeping the Arab world have little to do with Israel. They lay bare the preposterousness of the argument that we have been subjected to for so many years, that Israel causes the anger on the Arab street. The primary cause of the anger on the Arab street is Arab regimes that cannot deliver food, medicines, and decent standards of living to their populations. These people see the lavishness of their rulers' lifestyles and their own poverty, and that is what causes in them anger. Arab dictators have cynically used Israel to camouflage their own ineptitude. You mean to tell me that a few apartment complexes in Gilo or on the French Hill is what has caused the Egyptian street to revolt? Looking at the Middle East today, there is one stable democracy, one stable, democratic American ally that can be counted on and relied upon to always be on the side of America and the West: Israel, an island of stability and freedom in a sea of radicalism that is steadily encroaching on Europe and America. 2, if Egypt tears up the peace accord with Israel, it will destroy for many years to come any Israeli incentive to make peace. the underlying rationale of the entire peacemaking efforts between Israel and the Arab world, going back to Camp David in the 1970s, is that when an accord is reached, it is permanent, irrevocable, and all claims against the Jewish state cease. In exchange for that promise, Israel returns territory that it won in a defensive war and that cannot be restored once handed over. If Egypt rips up the accord, if, as the Muslim Brotherhood has said just this week, that when they seize control, they will recommit to war on Israel, it may send Israel into a defensive crouch that will end peacemaking in our times. I've been thinking all week about my meeting in Cairo with President Mubarak some 15 years ago. I'd organized a delegation of 40 rabbis from across the United States. We were in Egypt to promote the peace accords and to lobby for American aid to Egypt. Before I left New York, I'd asked for a meeting with Mubarak, but hadn't heard anything from his office. As soon as I entered my hotel room in Cairo, literally, I didn't even put down my bags. The phone rang in the room. It was some authoritative-sounding voice who ordered me to appear in the lobby early the next morning and that they would take me to the president. I could bring an additional 6 colleagues if I wanted. I had some reservations. After all, could have been anyone calling. But I felt that prudence dictated that I appear. They obviously knew who I was and had followed me into the hotel. And in any case, I wanted to meet the president. That's why we came. I did add those 6 colleagues. If I was going down, I didn't want to go down alone. The next morning, we met a number of menacing, mustached men who shoved us into their cars as we sped down the chaotic Cairo streets to the president's palace. We did our thing. We spoke with Mubarak. He spent an hour with us. He was exceedingly pleasant and engaging, constantly reminding us, however, that the Middle East was not America. We took some pictures, gave some interviews in the press, and moved on. On the way, we passed Tahrir Square, Liberation Square. We passed the October 6th bridge and the area where Anwar Sadat was assassinated. The October 6th bridge is named after the so-called victory of the Egyptians during the 1973 Arab-Egypt War, a war that they actually lost, but made unprecedented headway during the first few days. And as we passed the October 6th bridge, I remembered thinking back, way back, to 1979. I was a tank commander in the Israel Defense Forces and was stationed in the Sinai Desert. After the peace accords were signed, we evacuated everything. On my last day in Sinai, the desert, which had been brimming with all kinds of war material, was empty as the desert. Right before we crossed back into Israel, our bus stopped in front of a makeshift sign that had been placed there by an Israeli soldier. On it, he scrawled in paint these words: Lo nasognu, vitarnu leman shalom. We have not retreated. We have compromised for the sake of peace. The notion of going back to those days of war with Egypt fills me with dread. The idea that we have compromised for the sake of only 30 years of peace fills me with sadness. I hope with all my heart that the Egyptians themselves, those who seek moderation, democracy, and liberty, prevail, and that they begin to build a decent, prosperous society. And may the stewards of our country find the wisdom, patience, and fortitude to bring about that day.